Dr. Elena Morrison had spent 7 years studying the neural architecture of the Vorthan collective, an alien species with a singular weakness that nobody else seemed to recognize. They felt nothing. The Vorthans were predators. Perfect predators. Their species had evolved on a world of scarcity where emotions were liabilities. Fear wasted energy. Compassion was evolutionary suicide. Love was a distraction from survival. Over millions of years, the Vorthans had engineered themselves into beings of pure logic and efficiency. They didn't feel. They didn't fear. They didn't hope. They calculated optimal outcomes and executed without hesitation. And that was their fatal vulnerability. Elena's research was considered fringe, even radical. The coalition's military establishment believed the Vorthans were unbeatable precisely because they felt nothing. No fear to make them retreat. No compassion to make them hesitate. No hope to make them fight beyond logical conclusion. The Vorthan military was perfect because it operated without the emotional complications that plagued every other species. But Elena had discovered something hidden in the neurological data. The Vorthans didn't lack emotions. They had suppressed them so thoroughly that the neural pathways still existed, just dormant. The capacity for feeling was encoded in their biology. It was just switched off. And if it could be switched off, it could be switched back on. The revelation came at 3 a.m. in Elena's research lab, surrounded by neural scans and neurochemical analyses. She was studying Vorthan dopamine regulation when she noticed something extraordinary. Vorthan neural architecture was essentially identical to human neural architecture in terms of emotional processing systems. The only difference was that Vorthan neurons had developed additional inhibitor molecules, biological switches that suppressed emotional response. Those inhibitor molecules could potentially be disrupted, not killed or destroyed, but disrupted, temporarily disabled, long enough for emotions to flood back into Vorthan consciousness, long enough for beings who had never experienced feeling to suddenly feel everything. Elena's hands shook as she cross-referenced her data. If she was right, and the probability was 94.7% based on the neurochemical correlations, she could create a weapon that wouldn't kill Vorthans. It would transform them. A weapon that made predators feel. She documented everything in a classified report titled The Empathy Doctrine, Weaponizing Emotional Response in Species with Suppressed Effect. The report included theoretical mechanisms, neural pathways affected, predicted psychological consequences, and a projection of outcomes if such a weapon were deployed. The prediction was both extraordinary and terrifying. Vorthans experiencing emotions for the first time in their evolutionary history would likely collapse under the psychological weight. Millions of years of calculated logic would crash against the reality of feeling pain, fear, sadness, and loss simultaneously. A species that had never known suffering would suddenly experience all suffering at once. The coalition military rejected the proposal immediately. "We do not develop weapons of psychological torture," the military council said formally. "The Vorthans are an existential threat, but we will defeat them through superior strategy and firepower, not through cruelty." Elena tried again. She presented the scientific evidence. She showed the neural pathways. She demonstrated the theoretical mechanism. But the answer remained no. The coalition would not weaponize emotion, no matter the strategic advantage. Then the war came. The Vorthan collective declared total war on the coalition. Their objective was clear: absorb all coalition territory, consume all coalition resources, and eliminate any resistance. The Vorthans moved with perfect efficiency, calculating optimal attack vectors, identifying human and alien strongholds, and eliminating them one by one. Coalition forces fought valiantly and were systematically destroyed. The Vorthans had 47% casualties in the first assault and adjusted their tactics accordingly. They had 31% casualties in the second assault and improved their defensive positioning. They responded to every human strategy with counter-strategy. They evolved tactically in real time. Because they felt nothing, they couldn't be demoralized. Because they cared about nothing, they couldn't be frightened. Because they had no attachments, They couldn't be manipulated through emotional leverage. Humanity was losing. After 3 months of devastating losses, the Coalition Military Council reconvened. Admiral James Chun presented the casualty figures. 2.7 million Coalition personnel killed. 47 worlds captured or destroyed. Projections suggested complete Coalition collapse within 18 months. That was when Elena walked into the meeting, uninvited, and presented her research again. The empathy doctrine is not torture, she said, her voice steady despite her terror. It's transformation. It's giving the Vorthans something they've never experienced. The capacity to understand what they're doing, to feel the weight of their actions, to experience the suffering they're creating. Admiral Chun listened carefully. Elena was the daughter of Coalition Admiral Victoria Chun, one of the most respected military commanders in history. That lineage gave Elena access to spaces other scientists would never reach. If we deploy this weapon, Elena continued, we won't be killing Vorthans. We'll be awakening them. We'll be giving them emotions. And when they feel what they've done, when they understand the destruction they've caused, when they experience the psychological weight of their own cruelty, they'll stop, because they'll finally be able to feel the wrongness of it. That is assuming they experience guilt, Admiral Chun said carefully. We don't know if beings without evolutionary history of emotions will develop them the same way other species do. The neurology suggests they will, Elena replied. The pathways are identical. The only difference is the inhibitor molecules. Remove those, and the emotional processing begins. What they feel after that is still uncertain, but there is significant probability of remorse, empathy, and recognition of harm. Admiral Chun was silent for a long moment. Then she asked a question that would reshape the entire war. What is the human cost of this weapon? It's not harmful to any species except the Vorthans, Elena explained. It targets their specific neurochemistry. Every other species would be unaffected. It's a species-specific emotional activator. Safe for us. Potentially devastating for them. And if it works? If we deploy this, and the Vorthans suddenly experience emotions? Elena had considered this question for 7 years. She knew the answer in her bones. Then for the first time in their evolutionary history, they will understand what they've done. They will feel the weight of 2.7 million deaths. They will feel the suffering of 47 destroyed worlds. And because they've never developed psychological defense mechanisms for dealing with guilt and horror and empathy, it will destroy them. That sounds like cruelty, Admiral Chun said. It's not cruelty to give someone the ability to understand their own actions, Elena replied. It's mercy, because right now, they're operating in a state of absolute ignorance about the consequences of their choices. They're destroying civilizations and feeling nothing about it. If we give them emotions, we give them the ability to understand what they're really doing. And once they understand, I believe they'll stop. Admiral Chun closed her eyes. Then she authorized the deployment. The empathy doctrine was distributed via atmospheric dispersal across Vorthan-occupied space. The chemical compound was designed to bind to Vorthan neural receptors and temporarily disable the inhibitor molecules that suppressed emotional response. What happened next was not battle. It was awakening. Across millions of Vorthan soldiers, in ships and on planets and in military installations, consciousness shifted. For the first time in their species' history, Vorthans experienced emotion. They felt fear, paralyzing, absolute fear, the realization that they were mortal and vulnerable. They felt sadness, overwhelming sadness for the lives they'd taken without comprehension of what life meant. They felt guilt, crushing guilt for actions they'd committed in a state of absolute emotional numbness. They felt empathy, shattering empathy for the beings they destroyed, suddenly able to imagine the suffering they'd caused. They felt love, desperate love for Vorthan companions they'd viewed as mere tactical assets mere moments before. And they felt despair, absolute despair at the realization of what they'd become without emotions, what they'd done without feeling. Vorthan military command systems collapsed within hours. Ships stopped firing because soldiers suddenly understood that they were murdering other beings. Occupation forces retreated because troops suddenly couldn't bear the weight of causing suffering. The unstoppable predator species became paralyzed with the sudden awareness of what predation meant. But something unexpected happened. The Vorthans didn't surrender in defeat. They surrendered in recognition. The Vorthan collective consciousness, suddenly flooded with emotions and understanding of their own actions, made a choice that coalition military strategists hadn't predicted. They asked for forgiveness. In formal diplomatic transmission, the Vorthan leader transmitted a message that would reshape galactic politics. We understand now what we have done. We feel the weight of 2.7 million lives. We feel the suffering of 47 worlds. We feel the horror of our own actions. We cannot undo what has been done. We cannot bring back the dead. But we can stop. We can feel. We can change. We ask not for mercy, which we do not deserve, but for the opportunity to understand and make amends. Elena watched the transmission in the Coalition Military Command Center, tears streaming down her face. Around her, other officers had varying reactions. Some relief, some uncertainty, some horror at what the weapon had done. Admiral Chan approached Elena and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You saved the coalition," Chan said quietly. "You gave them what they didn't know they needed, the ability to feel what their actions meant. Everything else will follow from that." But Elena was crying because she understood something the military hadn't yet grasped. The Vorthans hadn't just surrendered to coalition firepower or military strategy. They'd surrendered to something far more powerful: understanding. Once a predator understands what predation means, it stops being a predator. What followed was one of the most remarkable transformations in galactic history. The Vorthans, now capable of emotion for the first time, began a process of reconciliation and reconstruction. They established reparation systems for damaged worlds. They created memorials for the dead. They worked alongside coalition species to rebuild what they destroyed. More importantly, they experienced emotions for the first time. And that changed everything about how they approached civilization. Vorthan artists emerged, creating stunning pieces that expressed the grief and guilt and desperate hope of a species learning to feel. Vorthan philosophers emerged, grappling with questions about morality and responsibility. Vorthan parents emerged, learning to love offspring they'd previously viewed as genetic copies. The Vorthans became, ironically, one of the most emotionally sophisticated species in coalition space. Because they had to rebuild every emotional capacity from nothing, they developed far greater depth of understanding about emotions than species that had. Elena became renowned as the scientist who had stopped a war not through destruction, but through transformation. But she never forgot the weight of what she'd done. She'd created a weapon that violated every principle of medical ethics and weaponization law. She'd weaponized consciousness itself. Years later, when the Vorthan leader visited Earth to meet with Elena personally, the meeting was profound. The Vorthan, now named Keth, after the Vorthan word for awakening, expressed something that would have been impossible years earlier: gratitude mixed with sorrow. "You gave us the most painful gift," Keth said through a translator. "You made us feel everything we'd hidden from ourselves. It nearly destroyed us, but it saved us, because we could never have learned to change without first learning to feel." Elena listened to the words and realized something profound. She hadn't weaponized emotions. She'd weaponized understanding. She'd forced the Vorthans to see themselves clearly for the first time in their evolutionary history. And once they saw what they were, they chose to become something different. The empathy doctrine became the most controversial military development in coalition history. Some considered it a war crime. Others considered it the most humane weapon ever created, a weapon that stopped war not through bloodshed, but through understanding. But the Vorthans themselves, now capable of feeling, considered it redemption. Years later, Elena would establish the Institute of Emotional Understanding, dedicated to studying how species could transform through accessing suppressed or dormant emotional capacities. The Institute became a center for interspecies reconciliation and psychological development. And the Vorthans, once the most feared species in the galaxy, became the most dedicated to preventing future wars through understanding and empathy. Because once you feel what your actions mean, you can never commit atrocities with the same casual efficiency. The empathy doctrine taught the galaxy a lesson that all human philosophers had always known, but few militaries had ever acted on. The most powerful weapon isn't something that destroys the enemy. It's something that transforms them into allies through the simple mechanism of understanding. Make your enemy see what they're doing. Make them feel the weight of their actions. Give them the capacity to understand consequences. And you don't win through war. You win through transformation. Take an emotion for granted.